Have you ever stared into a cup of cheap black coffee and seen the reflection of a modern-day slave? I have. At exactly 11:40 p.m., amidst the deafening roar of metal crushers and the suffocating stench of burnt oil, I swallowed a scalding mouthful of a $4.75 gas station brew. A terrifying realization hit me like a physical blow. I was bleeding my youth dry for a system designed to keep me perpetually poor. We are fed the illusion of prosperity, but the chilling truth is that most of us are exactly 2 missed paychecks away from sleeping under a cold concrete bridge. If you think you are free, you are heavily mistaken. You are running a marathon in a hamster wheel, suffocating in a glittering cage of consumerism. But what if I told you there is a way out? Is there a brutal, agonizing, yet ultimately liberating escape route that took me 28 years to carve out with my bare, scarred hands? The Stickman Investor warmly welcomes you to this space of brutal honesty. If you are ready to shatter the illusions holding you back, please hit that subscribe button to support the channel and give us the motivation to bring you more life-changing videos in the future. Let us strip away the romanticized myths of the American dream. Look at me. I was just a tired mercenary, blindly loyal to a cruel, invisible dictator named money. The digital clock on the factory wall blinked its blood-red numbers into the toxic, thick air. With every rhythmic, earth-shaking pound of the hydraulic presses, the concrete floor vibrated beneath my heavy, steel-toed boots, sinking my very heartbeat to the relentless, soulless machinery. I stood there, my protective suit torn at the elbows, my calloused, grease-stained hands desperately clutching that flimsy paper cup. That dark, steaming liquid was not a beverage. It was a cheap survival fuel, a bitter stimulant forced down my throat just to keep my heavy eyelids from collapsing halfway through another agonizing night shift. The moment that scalding liquid tore across my tongue, leaving an astringent bitterness that shot straight to my brain, an overwhelming wave of existential dread washed over me. I stared at the dark ring of coffee staining the cup and whispered into the deafening noise, "What the hell am I doing with my life?" The anxiety was absolute. Every sleepless night, every ounce of health, clarity, and youth I traded yielded nothing but starvation wages. It was just enough to cover the rent, the gas, and the caffeine required to drag my broken body back into the exact same loop the very next night. This is the invisible vortex, the gigantic rat trap society mockingly calls the rat race. You sprint until your lungs burn, sweat pouring down your face, heart hammering against your ribs, yet when you look down, your feet are still glued to the starting line. Fear began to infiltrate every cell of my body. It was the primal dread of a blue-collar night shift worker questioning if someone without inherited privileges, born with absolutely nothing but 2 hands destined to be wrung dry, could ever dare to utter the word wealth. Or was my destiny predetermined? Was I meant to sell my blood until my bones crumbled, only to close my eyes for the last time buried under a mountain of unpaid medical bills? If you have come here searching for a digital fairy tale about a broke kid who bought an obscure crypto coin and woke up a millionaire, or a day trading genius who bought a supercar after a month of reading charts, you are in the wrong place. Turn off your screen and chase those glittering mirages elsewhere. What you are about to hear holds no overnight glory. There are no flowery promises or empty words of instant gratification. This is a naked, coarse, and deeply painful blueprint of a relentless journey that spanned 28 grueling years. It is a journey that goes far beyond the mere multiplication of lifeless numbers in a bank account. It is, at its core, a ruthless psychological metamorphosis. It is the bloodstained path of a fearful, submissive slave to money transforming into the absolute master of his own destiny, standing fiercely on the untouchable peak of financial freedom. It is a road paved not with luck but with the unbreakable bricks of absolute silence and iron discipline. To build those unbreakable bricks of absolute silence and iron discipline, I first had to brutally tear down the psychological prison I had spent my entire life defending. It began the very morning after that existential crisis over the cheap gas station coffee. I walked out of the factory as the pale sun crept over the industrial smog, and for the first time I looked at the world not as a participant, but as an outsider dissecting a colossal illusion. I saw my exhausted coworkers climbing into brand-new, heavily financed pickup trucks they could barely afford, driving back to mortgaged houses filled with consumer garbage they did not need, all to impress neighbors they secretly despised. The system demands this of us. It conditions us to medicate our exhaustion with consumption, offering a fleeting dopamine hit of a new purchase to numb the soul-crushing reality of our indentured servitude. It realized then that if I continued to play their game, I would inevitably share their fate. To escape the slaughterhouse, I had to stop eating the feed they were putting in my trough. The immediate consequence of this awakening was a self-imposed, ruthless era of denial. I became a ghost in the vibrant world of consumerism. I moved out of my comfortable, overpriced apartment and rented a decaying, windowless basement room that smelled faintly of mildew and damp earth. I sold my reliable car and bought a rusted, dented sedan that rattled with every gear shift, ignoring the mocking stares and whispered jokes of the guys on the factory floor. They called me cheap, they called me crazy, they asked why I was working so many overtime shifts, if I was just going to live like a destitute monk. I never answered them. You cannot explain the concept of buying your freedom to people who are passionately in love with their chains. My silence became my armor. Every dollar I refused to spend on a restaurant meal, every new pair of shoes I left on the store shelf, every Friday night beer I turned down, was a deliberate act of rebellion. I began to view a dollar not as a piece of paper to be exchanged for a temporary pleasure, but as a captured sliver of my own life. Earning $100 meant I had surrendered a fraction of my youth, my energy, and my finite time on this earth to the grinding jaws of the factory. To spend it frivolously was to disrespect my own suffering. I began hoarding my capital with the frantic desperation of a man saving oxygen on a sinking submarine. My meals were reduced to rice, dried beans, and discounted frozen vegetables. The agonizing monotony of my diet was a daily physical reminder of my mission. There were nights in that freezing basement where the hunger for comfort, for just one moment of ordinary luxury, gnawed at my sanity. I would sit on the edge of my mattress, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my hands aching from the hydraulic press, crying silent tears of exhaustion. But then I would open my worn ledger. I would write down the $20 I had saved that day. I was not hoarding money, I was hoarding ammunition. I was quietly, desperately building a mercenary army of dollars that would one day march out into the global markets and fight for me, so that I would never have to bleed for a paycheck again. This architectural phase of my escape was devoid of any glamour. It was ugly, it was agonizingly slow, and it required a daily crucifixion of the ego, forcing me to find my worth not in what I owned, but in the ironclad strength of my resolve. As the mockery of my peers faded into the distant background of my focused mind, the real, excruciating work of building a financial fortress from absolute zero commenced. Having stripped my life down to its barest bones, I finally possessed a surplus, a small but growing pool of capital that needed a purpose. This is where the vast majority of the working class falls into a secondary trap. They leave their hard-fought savings to languish in bank accounts, where the silent, invisible thief of inflation slowly bleeds their purchasing power dry. I knew I could not simply save my way to absolute freedom. My money had to work harder than I did. It had to sweat, it had to endure, and it had to multiply while I was sleeping, while I was eating, and while I was back on the factory floor wearing out my bones. I educated myself with a desperate, ferocious hunger. I did not read the sensationalist headlines promising lottery-like returns on volatile assets. I dug into the dense, boring, and historically proven mechanics of compound interest, index funds, and value investing. Every time my paycheck arrived, I did not see numbers on a screen. I saw battalions of soldiers. Before a single cent went to rent, before a single dollar bought my meager rations of rice and beans, I deployed my army. I channeled every spare copper into broad, unglamorous market indices and carefully selected equities. I was buying microscopic pieces of the world's most profitable companies. While my coworkers were arguing over sports scores in the break room, I was sitting in the corner, covered in grease, reading annual reports and understanding how to extract a yield from the global economy. I realized that true wealth is not the accumulation of luxury goods, but the accumulation of income-producing assets. Every share I purchased was a tiny, relentless worker that required no sleep, no medical benefits, and no vacation days. They paid me dividends, pennies at first, a microscopic trickle of passive income that felt almost insulting compared to the agony of my physical labor. But I understood the terrifying, beautiful mathematics of time. I reinvested every single penny of those dividends. I fed the machine, letting the interest compound upon the interest. The first decade was a psychological torture chamber of delayed gratification. Watching a portfolio grow at 7 or 8% a year when you were starting with nothing Feels like watching a glacier carve a valley. You stare at it until your eyes bleed, and it seems entirely stationary. You question your sanity. You wonder if the gurus who promised overnight millions were right, and if your conservative, relentless discipline is just another form of self-imposed slavery. Yet, I held the line. I kept buying when the markets soared, and I bought with aggressive, predatory joy when the markets crashed and the masses panicked. When the financial media screamed that the sky was falling and ordinary investors liquidated their life savings in terror, I sat in my damp basement, calmly transferring my meager factory wages into the inferno, acquiring assets at fire sale prices. I was not trading charts. I was purchasing ownership of the future. The slow, grueling mechanics of accumulation eventually created a snowball effect that defied human intuition. The trickle of dividends turned into a steady stream, and that stream slowly gathered the ferocious momentum of a roaring river, quietly eroding the foundations of my financial bondage. Yet buying back your life with sweat, copper, and compounding interest is a brutal war fought entirely in the suffocating silence of your own mind. It is a psychological crucible that will break you down to your very atoms before it ever allows you to taste victory. The hardest part of this 28-year journey was never the physical exhaustion of the factory, nor was it the blandness of the rice and beans. It was the crushing absolute isolation. When you choose to step off the conveyor belt of normal society, you become an alien to those you once called friends. I watched as my peers married, took on massive debts for dream weddings, bought houses with swimming pools, and posted their smiling, heavily filtered vacations on social media. They were living the vibrant, colorful life that society dictates is the reward for hard work. I, on the other hand, was aging in the shadows. I missed birthdays. I declined invitations to bars. I skipped holidays. I existed in a self-imposed quarantine of frugality. There were countless nights driving home in my rattling, rusted car, staring at the taillights of the luxury vehicles ahead of me, where a dark, venomous doubt would whisper in my ear. It asked me if I was wasting my youth. It taunted me, suggesting that maybe I would die in an industrial accident tomorrow, leaving behind nothing but a fat brokerage account and a life entirely unlived. This mental warfare reached its terrifying peak during the catastrophic economic crashes that inevitably ripped through the markets. I vividly remember the days when the global financial system teetered on the brink of total collapse. I watched the numbers on my screen, the culmination of a decade of my blood, sweat, and starvation, evaporate in a matter of weeks. The red arrows felt like physical daggers in my chest. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, representing years of missed sleep and shattered joints, were just gone. The panic in the air was palpable. Experts on the news declared the end of capitalism. The urge to sell, to salvage whatever pathetic scraps were left of my portfolio and run back to the perceived safety of a savings account, was a primal, screaming instinct. It took a supreme, almost unnatural level of mental violence to suppress that urge. I had to detach my emotions entirely from my money. I had to kill the fearful, reactive animal inside me and replace it with a cold, calculating machine. I forced my trembling hands away from the keyboard. I reminded myself that I did not own imaginary numbers. I owned fractional shares of real businesses, businesses that would continue to sell goods, innovate, and survive long after the panic subsided. I embraced the terror, using my ongoing factory wages to buy even more shares as they plummeted to unprecedented lows. This is the secret they do not teach you in any financial literacy course. Wealth is not generated by intellect. It is forged by emotional endurance. It is the capacity to stand completely still while the entire world is running around you with their hair on fire. It requires an arrogance, a profound belief in your own strategy that borders on madness. I survived those crashes not because I was smart, but because I was unbreakable. I endured the sleepless nights, the cold sweats, and the crushing loneliness of being the only man I knew who was walking into the storm instead of running away from it. The crucible burned away every ounce of weakness I had, leaving behind a mind hardened into impenetrable steel. Emerging from that crucible of isolation, the ice in my veins eventually melted into the warm, untouchable dawn of total autonomy. After 28 years of relentless compounding, brutal discipline, and silent suffering, the mathematics finally achieved critical mass. I will never forget the exact moment it happened. I was sitting at the same kitchen table in a slightly better but still modest apartment. I opened my laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the pre-dawn darkness. The dividends and passive growth from my portfolio now vastly exceeded the wages I was destroying my body to earn. The mercenary army I had spent 3 decades building was finally large enough to conquer the invisible dictator. I had won. I walked into the factory that night, the smell of burnt oil and ozone hitting me just as it had for thousands of nights before. The deafening roar of the metal crushers vibrated through the concrete, but for the first time in my life, it did not sync with my heartbeat. I was no longer a part of the machine. I handed in my badge, turned my back on the blinding fluorescent lights, and walked out into the cool, silent night air. I did not scream in triumph. I did not throw my steel-toed boots in the air. I just wept. I wept for the terrified young man who had stared into that cheap cup of coffee all those years ago, and I wept for the sheer, overwhelming weight of the freedom that now rested on my shoulders. Let me be absolutely clear about what this freedom looks like, because it is nothing like the vulgar displays of wealth you see online. I did not go out and purchase a fleet of exotic supercars or a mansion with 30 rooms. I still drive a humble, reliable vehicle. I still wear plain, unbranded clothing. The ultimate flex of true wealth is not proving to strangers that you have money. It is never having to do anything you do not want to do, ever again. Wealth is waking up on a Tuesday morning, making a high-quality cup of coffee in your own kitchen, and sitting on the porch watching the sunrise, knowing that your time belongs entirely to you. Nobody owns my schedule. Nobody dictates when I eat, when I sleep, or when I spend time with the people I love. I bought back my life. The journey was agonizing, terrifying, and profoundly lonely, but standing here on the summit, I can tell you with absolute certainty that the view is worth every single drop of blood. If you are trapped in that infinite loop, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of a system designed to crush you, know that the door to your cage is unlocked. You just have to be willing to walk through it, into the cold, harsh wilderness of discipline and sacrifice. It will take years. It will demand everything you have. You will be misunderstood, mocked, and tested beyond your limits. But when you finally forge your own absolute autonomy, you will realize that you have achieved the most profound victory a human being can claim. You are no longer a slave to circumstance. You are the master of your own fate. Thank you for listening to my story, and I will see you in the next chapter of our journey. The grueling 28-year odyssey from a suffocating factory floor to the summit of total financial autonomy is a testament to the sheer, unbreakable power of human discipline. This journey was never merely about accumulating money. It was a brutal psychological war against the very fabric of modern consumer society. By rejecting the intoxicating yet toxic lure of instant gratification and choosing instead a life of extreme monastic frugality, the chains of indentured servitude were meticulously broken down. Every dollar saved was not viewed as a deprivation, but as a soldier recruited into an ever-growing mercenary army of compound interest. Surviving the catastrophic market crashes and the agonizing loneliness of straying from societal norms required an emotional endurance far superior to pure intellect. Ultimately, the profound sacrifices, the skipped holidays, the meager meals of rice and beans, the relentless overtime, and the mockery of peers culminated in the ultimate luxury, complete ownership of one's own time. True wealth is demystified here. It is not found in exotic cars, designer clothes, or sprawling mansions, but in the quiet, absolute freedom to wake up every morning, knowing that no one dictates your existence. This story stands as a raw, unfiltered blueprint for escaping the modern-day slaughterhouse of endless labor, proving that while the path of absolute denial is terrifying and lonely, the ultimate prize of self-mastery and unshakable autonomy is worth every single ounce of suffering. True wealth is not a measure of what you can buy, but a measure of what you can endure. Financial freedom is fundamentally a psychological battle, not a mathematical one. It demands the radical realization that every dollar spent on fleeting comforts is a fraction of your life surrendered, and that absolute autonomy can only be purchased through the ruthless, consistent sacrifice of your present ego for your future sovereignty. Begin by brutally auditing your expenses to distinguish between what you truly need and what society has conditioned you to want. Stop treating your income as a license to consume and start treating it as ammunition to buy back your time. Automate your investments into broad, income-producing assets before spending a single cent on discretionary items. Most importantly, Build your emotional armor. When the economy falters or peers flaunt their heavily financed lifestyles, detach completely. Find your self-worth in your unyielding discipline and the invisible growth of your freedom, rather than the temporary validation of material possessions. If you had to permanently give up one everyday luxury right now to start buying back your future freedom, what would it be? Please share your thoughts in the comments below so we can all learn and draw inspiration from each other's perspectives. If you found value in this message and want to join us on the journey to true independence, please hit the subscribe button to support the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating more powerful, life-changing content for you.